You guys, and thank you all for joining in. So we are in Luke 23. So if you do have a Bible with you and you just kind of want to track with that as we shared just now, that's where we're going to be. Just from the end of Luke chapter 22, actually leading into 23. What I want to talk to us a little bit about this morning. Hey, you're going to go and get a coffee? You want to go through this way? Yeah. I want to talk to us a little bit about what it feels like to have our worst moments laid bare. And I feel kind of slightly even nervous about sharing this story with you, with fear and trembling. But a few years ago, not that nervous, don't worry, Claudia. A few years ago, I was watching a rugby match at my friend's house, a Six Nations game. It was England-Ireland, and Ireland won, spoiler alert. And there was about 10 of us, and my friend invited around one of his friends that I'd never met before, nice enough guy, but it turns out that he was really passionate about rugby. And not only did he cheer when Ireland were doing well, but he also cheered England mistakes quite passionately as well. And I kind of didn't really enjoy it at all, and got quite annoyed, basically. And as a way of just relieving a little bit of stress from the whole thing, I was just getting a bit tense, and I was like, who is this guy? Can he just be quiet? Fair enough, you're doing well, but, just don't cheer our mistakes, okay? And 10, 15 minutes in, as a way of just sort of trying to get some stuff off my chest, I texted my friend David and just said, I said, please, can you ask your friend to leave? Okay, just as a text message, just as a bit of fun, And what I didn't realize was that David didn't have a TV license, okay? So he was playing the rugby game from his laptop onto the TV. And what I also didn't realize was that David had his text messages connected up to his laptop. So suddenly, on the TV with about 10 of us there in the living room, just this message popped up from Thomas D. Please, can you ask your friend to leave? And I wanted the ground to swallow me up, and I went completely bright red and just had to pretend that nothing had happened. And I honestly can't actually fully remember, when you're just so don't want it to be true, that's happened, that you kind of go into this trance. And I can't really remember what happened. I don't really know if anybody noticed or not. You're nodding. You think they did notice? Okay, Claudia thinks they did notice. And so sharing that story with you and being very vulnerable this morning, because my true character, because I can be a bit grumpy sometimes, especially when watching sport, was laid bare. And actually, I didn't know about 5 or 6 people out of about 10 of us, and they must have thought, okay, David, can you ask your friend to leave? Can you ask that grumpy guy that's texting? And I could tell many other stories, including WhatsApping by accident 70 other Edinburgh church pastors by mistake with a screenshot that I didn't mean to. But we don't have time for that. I have been laid bare more than once. And what we're thinking about today from the story that we've just heard retold, in the days before Jesus died, God exposed the powers that were really at work, okay? The powers that St. Paul wrote about in Ephesians. He said, for we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. And on Good Friday, which is what we've been reading about, it was all laid bare. It was all laid bare. It all drifted out kind of the murky backrooms of this world, and it became, or it sort of drifted into plain sight. It became so obvious for us to see the powers that were at work in the world. You've got the false accusations about Jesus. You've got the sham trial that was clearly, not right. You've got the mocking of Jesus. You've got the beating, the ridicule. And Jesus had warned his disciples some months before and said to them, said this, "What is hidden will eventually come out into the light." And this was exactly what was taking place in Jerusalem as the city prepared for Passover. Except we're not talking here about a stray text message. We're talking about the ugliness of all the powers of the world kind of being laid bare and converging all at once. The desire to have control, the desire to have more power, the desire to protect our economic wealth as well. The economic, political, social, and religious structures and forces converging on one day to try and defeat Jesus. It was all in plain sight, if that makes sense. And on the day that Jesus died, all of the Antichrist forces are easy to spot because they are laid bare and because they are anti-Christ. Take this awful war that's happening in Ukraine at the moment. Maybe people thought they knew what Putin was capable of, but now we know because it's all been laid bare for the world to see, with maternity hospitals and civilians targeted in this ruthless pursuit of power. And so on Good Friday, Jesus exposes and lays bare the sins of the world and then takes them upon himself on the cross. This was a dark day for humanity as we spat God out from our midst, unable to bear any longer, unable to behold the purity and the perfect love that was on display in Jesus Christ. And one of the clues of the darkness of this day comes in verse 11 and 12 of chapter 23, where Herod and his soldiers ridiculed and mocked Jesus and sent him back to Pilate. And it says, that day Herod and Pilate became friends. Before this, they had been enemies. It's kind of a big giveaway there that this was an unholy alliance. This was a kind of satanic union of enemies. And maybe you think, oh, satanic has to mean, horns, devils and cauldrons and Ouija boards. Or maybe you think, wow, this is quite intense that Thomas is talking about Satan at the front. But anything that partners with the powers that oppose God's kingdom is exactly that. Anything that partners with the powers that oppose God and oppose God's kingdom is exactly that. Little example, if you have more than one brother or sister, anybody have more than one brother or sister this morning? You'll have experienced this a little bit, maybe not in quite the intense way that it played out on Good Friday, but you are never closer than when you are united against a common enemy, okay? So my little brother Duncan and I would often squabble a lot when we were growing up, but then when we had to unite against our bigger brother Jonathan, we were the best of friends, okay? He was the big boss. We would become inseparable allies, ready to die for the cause, ready to do anything that it took to take him down. And largely it worked. And then we were back to being enemies again. And for Herod and Pilate, their unwillingness to pursue justice for an obviously innocent man, Jesus, was enough for them to form this union in opposition to the king and to the kingdom. And again, I'm not someone who loves saying super intense stuff just for the sake of it, but I do want to talk a little bit about passivity. Because passivity and being passive can be the way that the enemy grabs hold of our lives. Passivity is when we kind of care, but not actually enough to do anything about it. Apathy is where we used to care, but maybe now feel numb. Self-preservation is where we care, but not enough for it to cost us anything. And you don't need a better example than this. It's all being laid bare. Right. So Jesus is passed around as a prisoner from place to place, from leader to leader. He's essentially on remand. He's waiting for trial. It's his kind of 24 hours in custody. Maybe you've seen that program. Maybe some of you have experienced what that feels like to have 24 hours in custody, or maybe longer, to be powerless, to be at the mercy of others, to be alone. And it starts in the Sanhedrin, the Jewish court of Mosaic law, and at daybreak they question Jesus. Are you the Christ? Are you the Son of God? Well, you were right in saying that I am, Jesus responds. And at which point, they have what they want. They have their kind of gotcha moment, as we heard, the amazing drama that the guys reenacted. They had enough scraps to send him off to Pilate to be killed. And the religious leaders, it almost jumps off the page. They're kind of giddy with excitement at this point. They're in this kind of frenzy. So desperate were they to have this threat of Jesus removed from their religious and social life that their sinfulness was laid bare. They even broke all of their own rules. They held a trial on the eve of the Sabbath. They had a trial on the eve of a major festival. These were big no-nos for them. They lied outright about Jesus' opposition of taxes. Jesus never said that. In fact, he said the opposite. He said, render to Caesar what is Caesar's. But they desperately wanted him dead. At the same time, they were too cowardly to kill him themselves because it was against Roman law for them to execute anybody. So they passed the buck to Pilate. These religious leaders claimed that Jesus was a blasphemer, a heretic, a seditionist, but the reality was that they had succumbed to the temptation of envy, of rivalry, of blame. And these religious leaders had an unwillingness to confront their own failure in following God's law. And I don't know where you're at this morning, but we might read this and think, yeah, that's definitely me. You might read this and think, well, that could never be me, and I can't apply any of this to my life. Well, maybe so. But if we've ever opened the door to envy, to malice, we know that it can suck us into doing things that we don't feel proud of. We know that it can suck us into doing things that maybe we didn't think that we would normally do, because that's not us. I had COVID a few weeks ago, and it was a bit achy, wasn't much fun, but I generally just sat in bed and isolated from Claudia and Elijah like the whole time, and I read this book. I set myself this task of reading the book. It's the longest book I've ever I was going to say written, but I didn't write it. Longest book I've ever read, and it's a Russian story, and there's a story within the story that is called The Grand Inquisitor. Okay, and I'll just try and summarize it a little bit because it's very pertinent. And in this story, Jesus comes back in the second coming. Okay, it's obviously not the Bible; it's just a story. And he comes back to Spain, of all places. So who knew? And Jesus heals the sick straight away. It's the first thing that he does. And people know, the crowds know exactly who this is walking among them. They know this is Jesus returned again. However, after just a few hours, Jesus is arrested in this story. And inside his prison cell, the Grand Inquisitor, this powerful leader of the church, comes in and spends hours talking with Jesus, except he's the only one talking. And what he does is that he lectures Jesus on why Jesus is wrong to set people free, and what people really need is more security, more predictability in their lives, and that's what the church should be doing. Just offering that, not setting people free, not healing people, and that he simply cannot allow Jesus out of prison because Jesus will upset the status quo too much. The Grand Inquisitor is the church leader. He tells Christ that he cannot allow him to do his work on earth because his work is at odds with the work of the church. And you'll have to read it yourself when you get a week to lie in bed and read for 8 hours a day and occasionally have some porridge. But it's a haunting story, you know. And I guess it's asking this question, would God's people reject Jesus all over again? Would we? Is the work of churches actually in tune with the work of Jesus Christ? Or does it find itself at odds with it today? Then, are we obsessed with security and predictability? Or are we really living life with the Spirit? So that's the religious leaders. Pontius Pilate arrives on the scene. So he clearly doesn't want to be there. He's caught up in the wrong situation. He's drawn the short straw. He wanted to get back to Rome as quickly as he could. Pilate actually had a reputation, though, for being quite a cruel man, too. There's a historian called Philo who described Pilate not as weak and pathetic, as we often see him, but as inflexible and merciless. So he had a track history of being very harsh, and he seemed to really enjoy antagonizing the Jewish people. At one point, he kind of defiled their holy temple that we spoke about a couple of weeks ago. He put golden shields inscribed with the names and images of Roman gods in the middle of the holy temple of God's people. So he really liked causing trouble. Pilate examines Jesus and says, "I find no basis for a charge against this man." Again, Pilate says, "I have examined this man and found no basis for your charges against him." And then again, a third time, he says, "I have found in him no grounds for the death penalty." So Pilate's the one with the power here. He can make the big call. So how did Jesus end up on the cross? Well, deep down, I think Pilate was afraid that if there was an uprising in Jerusalem, it would be his name associated with it. It would be called the Pilate's uprising of whatever year, that his reputation would be sullied and he could kiss goodbye to any promotion that was coming his way. And so, yeah, he knew this was a blatant miscarriage of justice, but it wasn't important enough for him to get involved in. And so, it doesn't say in Luke's gospel, but it says elsewhere, he washes his hands of the situation. Something comes up, though, and it emerges that Jesus is Galilean and that Pilate might be able to pass him over to Herod. And you can just see how nobody wants really the ultimate responsibility for the death of Jesus. Passivity, politics, Pilate, the blind eye to injustice, the washing of the hands. And this is really Pilate's legacy. This is Pilate's contribution to history. When the going got tough, he passed the buck and evil prospered. I'm not sure what that beeping is, but I'm sure everything's fine. And finally, could we get a price check on aisle 3, thanks? There we go. Paul to save the day. Finally, we had Herod. And Herod wasn't the same King Herod that threatened to kill Jesus when he was born. It was his son. And this Herod was fascinated with Jesus, but more out of curiosity than faith. Herod wanted Jesus to be this kind of miracle monkey that would turn up and turn water into wine or heal somebody or do something impressive. But Jesus was having none of it. And so, like the soldiers elsewhere, Herod and his henchmen ridiculed Jesus. They dressed him up in an elegant robe and they mocked him. And it's interesting to note, isn't it, that we often mock what we don't understand. We also mock what we are too fearful to acknowledge is true. Say that again. We often mock what we don't understand, and we often mock what we are too fearful to acknowledge is true. So Herod was too scared to kill Jesus, but too angry with him to let him go. And so back to Pilate we went, and from Pilate to the crowds, and from the crowds to the cross. And this whole story, this whole sorry saga, this whole pathetic kind of abdication of responsibility and passivity, it lays bare the corruption and the desperation of the forces of evil to get their man on this day. Desperate to get rid of the evidence of God's perfect love, because that's who Jesus was. Jesus is the evidence of God's perfect love in the world, of God's perfect presence. And these forces are desperate to hold on to wealth, to power, to control, and to rid the world of the evidence of God's love. And it's all laid bare. Naked lying from the religious leaders, naked aggression from soldiers and political leaders, naked indifference from Pilate, naked cowardice from basically everybody, and the death of an innocent man, naked on a bit of wood, hanging there for the sins of the world. Jesus, as his cousin John the Baptist had pointed out years back, the Lamb of God who comes to take away the sin of the world. As we think about the cross this week, the cross unveils the love of God. But it doesn't just do that. The cross exposes our sin, and the cross lays bare the forces of darkness in the world and our collusion with them as well. Jesus of Nazareth was a problem that they all wanted to get rid of, but none of them wanted the blood of God's Son on their hands. Well, why was that? Well, firstly, because they all knew that he was innocent. It was plainly obvious that he hadn't done the things that they accused him of. No amount of setups and gotcha moments could change that. Could Jesus have spoken up and got himself acquitted? Well, maybe. Maybe they would have killed him anyway. Who knows? The point is that he didn't. He stayed silent, and he went to the cross like a lamb to the slaughter, because this was the will of God, and this was the love of God. In November last year, in 2021, there's a man from Missouri in the States who was released after being wrongfully convicted of a triple murder in 1978. He was imprisoned unjustly for 42 years. 42 years. He was called Kevin Strickland. He's now 62, and he was first arrested age 18. He'd claimed he'd been at home watching TV that night, but one of the victims that didn't die picked him out of a lineup, when you have a lineup of people, and he was convicted without any more evidence than that. 42 years. And years later, the same victim witness changed her mind, and she said, "Things weren't actually that clear then, but now I know more, and I'd like to help get him released." But this same witness died before she could fully recant her testimony. And so after 15,487 days behind bars, he was released. And how much compensation did he receive? None. Because in the state of Missouri, it only compensates prisoners who are exonerated through DNA evidence, and there was no DNA evidence, just eyewitness testimony. It's a crazy story, isn't it? I think we've got a photo of him behind. And there's not that much good that's come from that, really. And sometimes the powers seem to win. Sometimes injustice seems to win. And sometimes control and economic powers seem to win out. Sometimes racism seems to win the day. No one wants to take responsibility. Everyone wants to blame everybody else. And justice seems like it's a million miles off. And in the Good Friday story we've been reading and listening to, none of these leaders wanted to be the ones to kill Jesus, because sin likes to stay hidden. Hidden beneath the surface. Sin doesn't like to announce itself and say, "Hey, I'm sin. What are we going to do today?" It likes to blame others. It likes to find scapegoats, of which Jesus was the ultimate scapegoat. It likes to go untraced, and sin loves to justify itself. I'm sorry, somebody set me an alarm. I know I'm a bit long. I get the point. You can all turn off your alarms now, okay? I get the point. But sin loves to justify itself through warped logic. And I hope we can all relate to that. Oh, it's fine because, and it's okay because, and we justify our actions and we sin again and again, individually and as leaders and as the powers, until God is on a cross and we've killed him to save ourselves. And we've killed him to justify our own sin and our own warped logic. And if we don't see the awfulness and the ugliness of sin, well, then we don't get to revel in and glory in God's amazing grace. What would happen if we were laid bare the same way that these leaders were? Because we can see it so easily. What would happen if you were laid bare the same way that I was laid bare that day, that fateful day in my friend's living room? It would be tough. I'm sure, wouldn't it, having all your worst moments put in front of a jury or put in front of our friends or people that we don't even know, it'd be exposing, it would be humbling, but in a way, it's already happened. And in a greater way, what I want to say is that we do not need to be afraid, because God sees us. God really knows the most brilliant and amazing parts of us, and also the worst parts of us that are most in need of redemption. What did Jesus say to the disciples? What is hidden will eventually come out into the light. And I think when the world hears that, it's scared. Because what if they knew? I'd get cancelled. I'd get sacked. I'd get cut off. But as people who belong to Jesus, as people of the crucifixion and the resurrection, when we read those words of Jesus, what is hidden will eventually come out into the light. We do not need to be afraid, because God has taken on our sin and God has forgiven us. He knows when we lie. He knows when we're aggressive. He knows when we're indifferent. He knows when we're cowardly. And he still chose to die for us in those moments. So if we want to experience freedom, we lay ourselves bare before God. And we experience the love of God for the whole of who we are. We don't need to hide away anymore. That's where the enemy wants us. Because when we hide, we're not honest with ourselves. We're not honest with others. Let's bring it out into the open. And let's remember amazing grace. Let's remember Jesus on the cross, dying for the very powers and sins that held him there. As I said, most of the world are petrified of being found out and hung out to dry because of things that they've done. But we are God's children. And the more that we confess our sin, the more we realize that our sin is powerless over us. And the more that we are amazed at God's grace that covers all of our sin, as far as the east is from the west. That's how far he's removed our transgressions, our sins from us. So what I want to just leave us with, and I am finishing right now, is let God's grace do its work in you. And don't put anything in the way of that. Let's not hide away from the grace of God. Let's allow God's love to overflow into the bits of us that sin has taken hold of, the bits of us that we don't think anyone or even God can see, because nothing is too far gone for God to transform.